Welcome to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 45, and my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. It's August, and we are in the thick of gardening season. We're experiencing the annual zucchini tsunami. I've been making lots of zucchini bread and zucchini fritters. I'm expecting ripe tomatoes in another week or two, and it'll be like this probably through the end of September until we get our first frost. We've had a few days of rain, which is unusual for this time of year. July and August are typically our driest months, but the rain has been welcome, and it has given me some opportunities to stay inside and sew. But mostly the big project that I did last week was to tear apart and rearrange and reorganize my sewing area. So my sewing area is spread out through all the bedrooms in our upstairs. My husband and I sleep in the largest bedroom, but that's also where my big sewing machine lives and my Necky BF, which I use for quilt piecing. My cutting table and my serger are in my younger daughter's bedroom. My older daughter's bedroom is still set up for guests. We have a double bed in there, but that's where I keep some of my fabric and my AccuQuilt cutter. And then we had a spare bedroom, which had a twin bed in it. And I decided that we really didn't need to have beds in both bedrooms. I took the bed out of my younger daughter's bedroom last summer. So I took the bed out of the spare bedroom and I bought a couple of big wire shelving units from Home Depot and put those up. And I was able to get everything out of the closets and onto those shelves where now I can see it and it's labeled and organized. And I am so much more productive because I am not digging through bins to get to supplies. I know exactly what I have, so I'm not buying duplicates of things. And it has made my sewing so much more enjoyable. When I need something, I go to one of those wire shelves and I pull out the labeled bin and I find it and I put it back. I did finish up, or maybe not finish up, but move along a few more projects. I have an English paper piecing project that I've been working on, and I got all of the units prepped for that. So now it's just a matter of sewing the units together. I decided not to finish the Fat Quarter Fancy Star quilt that I was working on. I made a few blocks and I started laying it out on my design wall, and I just wasn't feeling the love. The units are fine, they're beautiful, they're star blocks, but my choice of fabrics was not great. So, or at least for me, it might speak to someone else. So I've decided that what I'm going to do with that one and with some of my other UFOs is to package them up and donate them to our Mennonite Central Committee relief sale, which happens in Ritzville, Washington, the first weekend in October. And Ritzville is about an hour west of Spokane. There is a big quilt auction. I've donated quilts to the quilt auction in the past, but as part of the sale, they also have a yard sale area where they have craft supplies and quilting supplies. My friend Margaret used to go there and look for half-finished quilts. She would take them home and finish the quilt and then donate it back to the quilt auction the following year. So I know that sometimes people are looking for projects like that, so I'm going to package up all of my UFOs and things that I know that I probably won't finish and donate them to the yard sale. I've been making some quilted pouches, and those are fun. They're kind of like potato chips. They're quick and easy and instant gratification. What I do will be to layer a big piece of yardage with some leftover batting, and then I'll quilt that on my Q20, and then I can cut those into the appropriate sizes for the bags that I want to make. I also knocked out another déclique top, and that pattern kind of surprised me. It has turned out to be the sleeper pattern of the summer. I've made 5 of them so far. Out of a woven rayon fabric, it's just the perfect top to throw on when it's 90 plus degrees here. And it may only be 90 plus degrees for a couple of weeks, but I'll tell you, when it is, I'm wearing those tops and they've been a godsend. This most recent top I made from a yard of fabric. It's a Moda rayon that I picked up at Vicky's Quilts Down Under in Missoula a couple of weeks ago when I was down there with my friend Robin. And I really love the fabric. I love the pattern on the fabric. And I wore that top out to dinner on Saturday night. We went out to eat with a cousin of mine who was visiting. The weather is starting to cool off though, and before long, it's going to be time to start making cooler weather tops, getting out some of the sweater knits that I bought last year that I haven't used yet, making some pants, and filling some of the holes in my wardrobe. Last week, I also went to the Bernina dealer, or the quilt store where I teach in town, and I picked up some presser feet for my new-to-me Bernina 880. I am really enjoying sewing on that machine, and I decided that I needed to get a few additional presser feet. So, as it so often happens, the podcast topic for the week tends to be about things that I'm doing in my own sewing practice. So today's discussion is going to be about presser feet. This is not intended to be a comprehensive, exhaustive list of all of the presser feet that are available. I'm going to touch on probably the most popular ones, the most commonly used ones. I won't be talking about presser feet for sergers or cover stitch machines. That needs to be its own episode. I'm going to focus on presser feet for sewing machines today. And I would encourage you to look at the website for the manufacturer of your particular sewing machine and see what's available for your model. I'm going to start by saying that it's important to identify what kind of machine you have and what the width of the stitch, the maximum width of the stitch that your machine can make. Some machines can only make a 5mm wide stitch, some make a 7mm wide stitch, and some make a 9mm wide stitch. And the presser feet may be specific to those widths, so you'll need to know what machine feet fit your machine. There may also be associated stitch plates that have to be used with specific feet, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. And the last thing to note before we start talking about feet is that some machines are equipped with an even feed or a dual feed system, and those machines that have those kinds of systems typically have a separate set of presser feet to work with those systems. So on my Janome 6600, for example, I had a presser foot set that worked with the even feed system. On my Bernina 880, many of the feet come in both a regular version and a dual feed version. And which one you choose depends a bit upon the application. So it might seem wasteful or extra expensive to have two versions of the same foot, but there were times when I used my 1/4 inch piecing foot, my regular piecing foot, and there were times when I used my 1/4 inch even feed foot. So having the ability to choose which foot to use in which situation can be important. But if budget is a consideration, I totally get that, and you may have to decide which version of the foot you're going to buy. I should note, too, that there is a difference between integrated feet and snap-on feet. You can get the shank part of the foot, and again, this is something that you'll have to check. Do you have a high shank or do you have a low shank foot? Some machines use a low shank foot where the shank of the foot is maybe 1/2 inch, and some of them use a high shank foot where it's 3/4 inch. I'm pulling these numbers out of my head because I haven't sat down recently to measure the shank heights. But knowing the shank height is going to be important, especially if you're using a vintage sewing machine. If you buy the appropriate shank for your machine, though, sometimes you can get the separate feet that will just click into that bar on the bottom of the shank, and you don't have to continually change the entire foot. All you do is pop off. There's usually a little button on the back of the shank. You pop that button and the foot drops off, and you can replace it with a different kind of foot. I tend to use those mostly on my vintage machines, where sometimes it's hard to find the appropriate integrated foot for a machine. But I also had that system on my Janome 6600 where all I had to do was put one shank on the machine, and then I could switch out whichever presser foot was most appropriate for me to use. Industrial machines typically use a high shank foot, so my Necky BV, which is my industrial Necky, uses high shank feet. My Juki 1541 is a walking foot and a needle feed machine, so it's got a specialty foot that isn't really a high shank foot. It's actually a two-piece foot. The Singer 78-1, if you've ever run across one of those, has a similar foot because that's also a needle feed machine. But that's getting a little esoteric, and I may have to do an entire show on industrial sewing machine feet too, in addition to serger and cover stitch feet. So if that's something you're interested in, let me know. We will jump right in though and start talking about the presser feet that you're most likely to run into when doing any kind of general quilting or garment sewing. And we'll start with the general purpose or zigzag foot. This is the one that comes installed typically on your machine when you buy it. And you can tell that it's a general purpose foot because it's got an elliptical opening that is wide enough to allow the needle to swing back and forth when it's doing a zigzag stitch. You need to be careful when you're switching presser feet to make sure that your needle position or your stitch setting is not going to be incompatible with the presser foot that you've chosen. So you don't want to accidentally run the needle into the presser foot and potentially break the needle or get your machine out of time. So the general purpose foot will allow you to do zigzag sewing or decorative sewing where the needle is moving back and forth from right to left. You can also use that foot for regular straight stitch sewing, but I would suggest that if you're going to do some straight stitch sewing, especially if you're doing top stitching or things like that, where the stitches are going to be visible, or even if they're not going to be visible, you just want a really neat, durable seam, then you might want to switch to a straight stitch foot. And I'm kind of partial to the straight stitch foot, and you can tell because I named my podcast The Straight Stitch. I really like neat and tidy straight stitches. And the straight stitch foot is one that has just a circular opening large enough for the needle to pass back and forth through it. If you use that in combination with a straight stitch plate, which also has a circular opening large enough for the needle to pass through, what you get are beautiful, excellent straight stitches because those holes support the needle and keep it from moving back and forth and deflecting. You absolutely want to make sure that your machine is set for straight stitching. If you leave it on zigzag and put a straight stitch foot on it, that is a recipe for trouble. I will also note that some straight stitch feet are wide. They may be as wide as your general purpose foot, but most often, especially on the vintage sewing machines, I see a lot of narrow straight stitch feet, and I've gotten to be particularly fond of that narrow foot, so much so that if I can possibly find a narrow straight stitch foot for my machine, I will buy it and use that one as much as I can. I did that with my Juki 1541. It came with a regular wide general purpose foot, but I switched out for a narrow straight stitch foot. I can't really give you a good reason why I like that foot and why I prefer that foot, although It's narrow enough that I don't always have to switch over to a zipper foot for certain applications, so that may be why I like it so much. The one drawback to a narrow straight stitch foot is if it happens to be so narrow that it's actually riding between the feed dogs, you may not get good gripping of the fabric between the presser foot and the feed dogs, in which case you may want to switch back to a wider foot. So that's just something to keep an eye on. If it feels to you like you're having trouble keeping your fabric from being wonky, that may be part of the reason why. But I really do love those narrow straight stitch feet, and that's the one that I keep on my Necky BF and also on my Necky BV. So anytime I have to do any straight stitching, that's the foot that's on the machine. Next up are the zipper feet, and these come in a variety of flavors. I'm really partial to the zipper foot that's on my Necky BF, the machine that I use for quilt piecing. And the reason I like that one is because you screw the foot onto the needle bar, and there's a second screw on the back of the foot. And when you loosen that, it allows you to move the actual foot to the right or to the left. So you can set where it is in relation to the zipper. You can set where it is in relation to the needle. So if you want to sew on the right side of a zipper, you can do that, or you can move it and sew so that you are sewing on the left side of the zipper. And I really like that style. I really like that foot. It's a narrow foot. It gets into areas where I might not be able to get to with a general purpose or even a straight stitch foot. I am not quite as fond of the zipper foot on my Janome 6600. That machine has the ability to move the needle position. So the foot itself doesn't move. You move the needle to the right or to the left to position it where you want it in relation to the zipper and in relation to the foot. That foot is narrower at the front than it is at the back, and I've never quite understood why, because it's wide enough at the back that I can't get up close to the zipper, and I can't get up as close as I would like to the zipper as I can on the Necky zipper foot, which is narrow all the way from the front to the back. So I have always found myself using the Necky to insert zippers because I just find the zipper foot on the 6600 to be a bit clunky. You might also want to buy an invisible zipper foot if you do a lot of invisible zippers. And this is a specialty foot where the teeth of one half of the zipper ride in a groove on the underside of the foot. And this allows you to put in an invisible zipper accurately and quickly. So that's one that you might want to have in your arsenal of tools if invisible zippers are something that you do frequently. Quilt piecing feet that's another foot that comes in a variety of flavors. On my Necky BF for quilt piecing, I tend to use actually my narrow straight stitch foot because it just so happens that the edge of the foot is 1/4 of an inch from the needle. So I can position the fabric so that it's riding along the edge of the foot and know that I will get an accurate 1/4 inch seam. Other feet that you might be able to find may have a blade that comes down on the right-hand side that acts as a guide, and you simply run your fabric along the edge of that guide, and that helps you to create the 1/4 inch seam. There are other feet that if you use the edge of the foot, it will create a 1/4 inch seam, but I will caution you that it depends on the machine, and it's always worth measuring your 1/4 inch foot against your needle to make sure that you are actually getting an accurate 1/4 inch seam. I have a Singer 66 that I retrofitted with a hand crank so that I could take it. It's a portable machine. I can take it outside on the porch and sew if I want. And I cannot find a 1/4 inch foot for that machine that gives me an accurate 1/4 inch. It's actually just a tad larger than 1/4 of an inch, which is fine if I'm going to do an entire project on that machine. It is not fine if I am switching back and forth from that machine to another machine on the same project. What I typically do if I want to sew on that machine is I set up a seam guide and use that instead of a 1/4 inch foot. I'll put a straight stitch foot on it and measure accurately with a seam guide, it's a little plastic ruler that has a hole in it, and you put the needle down in the hole and you can measure to determine where your 1/4 inch marking needs to be. So I will set up a seam guide on that machine and do it that way. And honestly, a seam guide could be as simple as a stack of Post-it notes or a Lego. I've seen people use a Lego as a seam guide. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. Just be aware that it's always worth measuring to make sure that you're getting an accurate 1/4 inch seam with the foot that you've chosen to do that. I really like my edge stitch foot, and it's probably because it's so versatile. You might also see this as a stitch in the ditch foot. It can be an edge stitch foot and a stitch in the ditch foot if your machine has the ability to change needle positions. If you're working on an older straight stitch machine, it's only going to be, it will only allow you to do stitch in the ditch. So this foot looks like a general purpose foot with a blade that comes down in the middle of the foot. And that blade rides in the seam. So if you're doing a stitch in the ditch seam where you're stitching in the seam between two pieces of fabric, that blade will ride in that seam and give you a really, really nice, accurate straight stitch that doesn't wander from side to side. If you position the blade in the seam and then move the needle to the left, you can use it as a top stitching foot. So you can adjust the needle position to give you a 1/16 of an inch top stitching, an 1/8 of an inch top stitching, whatever distance you want the top stitching to be from the seam. You can do that if your machine allows you to change the needle position. I also use this foot when understitching. So when you are understitching, which is sewing the seam allowance to the facing of a garment, what you would do is place the garment so that the blade is riding in that seam, and then you would adjust your needle position to the left so that your needle is going through the 2 layers of fabric, the seam allowance and the facing, and that will give you an accurate understitching line along your facing. It might be a bit of overkill if you don't really care how close your understitching or how accurate your understitching line is, because it's going to be on the inside of the garment, but I find it makes it a little bit easier for me. I have a set of compensating feet for my Necky industrial machine, and they are similar to an edge stitching foot only in that they allow you to do an accurate line of top stitching a specific distance away from the seam. And the way they work is the foot is actually in 2 pieces. So the right half of the foot moves independently of the left half of the foot. So you can position the foot along a seam, and the bulkier part of the seam will push one side of the foot up. So you've got a foot that's riding at 2 different levels. And that will allow you to top stitch along a seam. And the set that I have is in different measurements. So I can top stitch with a compensating foot a 1/16 of an inch away, an 1/8 of an inch away, a 1/4 of an inch, a 3/8 of an inch, 1/2 an inch, etc., etc. So I just have to choose the one with the correct measurement on it and put it on my machine. You may recognize a blind stitch foot because typically it's got a white piece of plastic in kind of a triangular shape with a little lip on it, and that sticks out from the right side of the foot. What that allows you to do is to create a blind hem. And this may not make sense because I'm trying to explain it verbally when it really needs some pictures. But if you go to YouTube and look up a video on blind stitching, making hems with a blind stitch foot, you'll be able to see this foot in motion. What happens is, and this is a challenge for somebody who's as spatially deficient as I am, you have to fold your fabric kind of into 3 layers and position the foot so that it is sewing back and forth on a single layer, which will be on the inside of your pants. Let's say you're doing pants. And it zigzags back and forth, and as it zigs to the left, it catches both the fashion fabric and the inside fabric and connects them. And then it zigs back to the right to make a couple of stitches in the single layer fabric, and then goes back to the left to catch the fashion fabric again. So it'll go back and forth as it moves along the hem that you're making. And when you're all done and you turn your garment inside out, you've got a nearly invisible line of catch stitches around your hem that make a very professional finish. I'm looking at my notes here, and I think that what I'm going to do is split this up into 2 episodes because I have enough discussion left about another half dozen presser feet that I want to talk about that I think they deserve their own episode so that I'm not rushing through them. The last one that I'm going to talk about today is a walking foot. You may notice when you're sewing that you get to the end of the seam and the 2 pieces of fabric are no longer match up. And that's typically because the feed dogs are feeding the lower fabric into the machine a little bit faster than the upper fabric. And that can be an advantage when you're doing things like setting in sleeves because that helps you to ease the sleeve in. But when you're doing things like sewing stripes or plaids where you want things to match along the seam, it can be frustrating to try and keep those 2 pieces of fabric matched up. Enter the walking foot. What the walking foot does is it allows the machine to feed both fabrics at the same rate. And that will help you to keep your plaids straight or your stripes together. A walking foot is also useful when you're doing straight line quilting or the fabric beneath your foot is a little bit bulkier. I know some people who like to use it to attach quilt binding. So if your machine doesn't have an integrated dual feed or even feed system, you will have to buy a separate walking foot. And this is kind of a bulky unit that attaches to your needle bar and then usually has a kind of a forked portion that hooks up into the screw between the needle bar or the screw on the needle bar. And it's, again, I'm trying to describe something that you really need to look at a picture for. But what that does is it enables the machine to feed both pieces simultaneously at the same rate. If your machine has an integrated dual feed or even feed system, it's automatically part of the machine, although you have to engage it. It doesn't happen automatically. And typically, it requires a special set of feet. So on my Janome, I had a separate set of feet for the dual feed system. On the Bernina, there are dual feed feet that work with the even feed system, and they typically have a D after the number. So you might see the 37 patchwork foot, and then you might see the 37D. And all that means is that the 37D foot is intended to be used with the dual feed system. This is one of those situations where it might be a judgment call. You might say to yourself, well, I don't want to buy 2 sets of feet to do the same thing, so I'll just get dual feed feet for everything, which is okay. But there may be situations where you don't want the dual feed and you might prefer to have the regular presser foot instead of the dual feed presser foot or even feed foot. I don't typically like to sew patchwork with my even feed system. I didn't like it on my Janome 6600 and I don't particularly like it on the Bernina. I like to be able to do patchwork with just a regular foot. But you may be exactly the opposite. You may prefer to do your quilt piecing with a dual feed foot, in which case that would be the one that you would choose. So this is an area where you're going to have to kind of, you might have to make some compromises, either by getting a dual feed foot and using it exclusively or shelling out the extra money to have both versions of the same foot. And believe me, I get it. Presser feet can be expensive, especially Bernina presser feet. So do what's right for you. If you want to explore your presser feet a little bit more thoroughly and more in depth, you can do one of two things. You can go to your manufacturer's website, because typically most manufacturers have information about the feet that are available for each model. The other thing you can do is get a reference book, and I just pulled two off of my bookshelf. One is called The Sewing Machine Attachment Handbook by Charlene Phillips, and the other one is called The Sewing Machine Accessory Bible by Wendy Gardner and Lorna Knight, and I will put links to both of those books in the show notes if you want to check either of them out. It's always good to have a reference guide available. Bernina has the Big Book of Feet, which talks about the different feet that are available for the Bernina machines. I think Janome has something similar. And those are good reference guides to keep next to your sewing machine, because you might encounter an instance where you're not sure what presser foot would be the most appropriate. And checking out the accessory list or foot guide will give you some indication of which one to use. So I think we're going to stop there this week. I will do more on the additional presser feet that I have on my list in a future episode, possibly next week. I just have to see how the schedule is going to kind of fall out. I really appreciate all of the feedback I've been getting recently. Thank you for the emails. Thank you for the fan mail that you send through Buzzsprout. Thank you for the reviews and the ratings that you've left on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. I really appreciate it. The podcast audience continues to grow, and I think some of that is through word of mouth. So I really appreciate those of you who are letting your friends know about it and encouraging them to listen. The show notes for each episode can be found at the podcast website, which is www.thestraightstitchpodcast.com. There is a guest form there if you would be interested in being interviewed on the podcast. I would love to hear from you. Please fill out that podcast form or that guest form. That goes into a database at the back end of my system and allows me to keep track of things. You can also send me feedback at janet@janetzabo.com. That's my main website, janetzabo.com, where I keep my blog, and I post 3 to 4 times a week there about what's going on with my sewing projects and life here in Montana. Last week I put up some pictures of some chicks because one of my hens went broody and actually hatched out a couple of chicks. And that hasn't happened in a number of years. So I was pretty excited about that. And there were several chick pictures on my website, on my blog last week. And from there, you can also visit my Big Sky Knitting Designs website, which is where I have all of my books and knitting patterns from when I was a knitting designer many years ago. So I think we'll wrap it up there for this week. I hope that this has been informative and educational and helpful. If you have any questions, feedback, comments, other presser feet you would like me to talk about in future episodes, please use the fan mail feature on Buzzsprout if you download from Apple or Spotify, or you can send me email, janet@janetzabo.com. And until next week, I hope you have a great week and that you get to go sew something.